She was 22 years old and had exactly $11 to her name when she walked out of her uncle's house for the last time. She carried a canvas pack that held a change of clothes, a tin of tobacco she didn't smoke, and a drawknife with a handle worn so smooth it felt like riverstone. The drawknife had belonged to Harriet Beaumont, the old chairmaker who had taught her everything worth knowing, and it was the only thing in the world that felt like it still had her name on it. What the people of Dunmore's Landing did not know, what they could not have guessed as they watched her trudge past the mill and out toward the Garrison Road, was that the derelict boathouse sitting at the edge of Kettle Cove had been sitting there for 11 years, and that inside it, something had been waiting all that time for exactly the kind of person who knew how to look. Settle in close. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and we'll tell you the story of Wren Balfour. Wren was not from the Landing. She had come there at the age of 7, in the back of a wagon, driven by a man she called Uncle Clem, though he was her mother's cousin twice removed and felt no particular warmth toward the distinction. Her mother had died of a fever that swept through the logging camps along the Madawaska that summer, and her father had been gone long before that. Gone in the way of men who leave slowly, and then all at once, a little less present each season until one morning the chair at the table is simply empty and nobody says his name anymore. Uncle Clem was not a cruel man, exactly. He was a practical one, which in Wren's experience amounted to nearly the same thing. He took her in because the neighbors would have talked otherwise, and he kept her because an extra pair of hands around the cooperage never hurt anyone. She learned early to be useful and quiet. She learned that a body who makes themselves indispensable is harder to send away. What saved her, or rather, what made her worth saving in the eyes of the town, was Harriet Beaumont. Harriet ran the small chair-making shop on the back lot behind the hardware store. She was 63, a widow, built like a fence post, with hands that looked carved from the same ash she worked. She had come to the Landing from somewhere in Nova Scotia 20 years before, set up her shop, and proceeded to mind her own business with a thoroughness that most of Dunmore's Landing found either admirable or suspicious, depending on their temperament. She made Windsor chairs mostly, the saddle seat kind, with legs raked at precise angles and spindles fitted so tight you couldn't slide a piece of paper between them. They were the best chairs anyone in the region had ever sat in, and people came from as far as Perth to buy them. Wren had taken to stopping outside Harriet's shop on her way back from school, drawn by the sound of the drawknife pulling long curls of wood from a spinning leg blank. One afternoon, Harriet had looked up and said, without preamble, "You going to stand out there every day, or are you going to come in and be useful?" And that was that. For 6 years, Wren spent every hour she wasn't needed at the cooperage inside Harriet's workshop. She learned how to read the grain of a plank the way other people read faces, the subtle lift of figure in hard maple, the way quarter-sawn oak glowed differently in morning light, the feel of a piece of cherry that had been dried too fast and would crack on you 18 months after you'd built it. She learned to use a spokeshave and a brace, a reamer and a travisher. She learned that the mortise had to be drilled at exactly the right compound angle, or the leg would rack under weight, and she learned how to calculate that angle using nothing but a bevel gauge and her eye. Harriet was not a sentimental teacher. She corrected Wren's mistakes without softening them, and she praised good work with a single nod that somehow meant more than any speech. The drawknife she gave Wren on her 15th birthday. It was Harriet's own, the one she had used since her own apprenticeship, its blade still sharp and true, its handles darkened to near black with decades of oil and use. She wrapped it in a piece of flannel and handed it across the shaving horse without ceremony. "You've earned it," she said. "Don't lose it." Wren had not lost it. She had never once let it go dull. When Harriet died of a stroke the winter Wren was 21. The shop and everything in it passed to the estate of Harriet's son-in-law, a man named Gerald Finch who lived in Ottawa and had never once visited the Landing in all the years Wren had known Harriet. He arrived 3 weeks after the funeral, driving a very clean motor car and wearing a suit that cost more than most people in town made in a month. He walked through the shop with his hands clasped behind his back, nodding at the tools and the seasoned lumber and the half-finished chair blanks, as though he were taking inventory of a hardware shed. He offered Wren 30 days to vacate the premises. She pointed out that she had been apprenticed to Harriet for 6 years, that the shop's reputation, and therefore its value, rested largely on work she had done, that Harriet had spoken of leaving the business to her. Gerald Finch listened to all of this with the patient expression of a man who knows that listening costs nothing and changes nothing. "My mother-in-law's wishes," he said, are not a legal instrument. He had a buyer for the property, a man from Kingston who wanted to expand his lumber operation, and the sale was already close to finalized. Was there anything else? She had gone back to Uncle Clem's house that night, because there was nowhere else to go. She stayed 3 weeks, sleeping in the same small room she'd had as a child, eating meals in silence while Clem and his wife discussed the situation in the careful way people discuss things they've already decided. At the end of the 3rd week, Clem sat down across from her at the kitchen table, with a ledger open between them. He went over figures she had never been shown. The cost of her meals over 15 years, the room, the firewood, the clothing. He didn't call it a debt, he called it a tally. The distinction felt like a blade between the ribs. She packed her canvas pack the next morning. She took the tin of tobacco from Clem's shelf on the way out, not because she wanted it, but because it was the only thing she could think of to take that would register. She walked out the door with $11, her pack, and Harriet's drawknife, and she did not look back. The Garrison Road ran northeast out of Dunmore's Landing, past the mill and the old Anglican cemetery, and then curved down toward the water's edge where the cove opened up between 2 granite outcroppings. Wren had walked this road 100 times. She knew the boathouse at the end of the cove, the way you know a landmark you've stopped seeing because it's been there so long. The Ballantyne Boathouse, people called it, after the family who had abandoned it more than a decade ago when the fishery went under. It sat on a granite shelf above the waterline, cedar-shingled, its doors hanging on corroded hinges, one wall listing slightly toward the cove as if it had decided to lean in and look at its own reflection. For 11 years, it had belonged to no one in particular, and nothing in general, or so everyone thought. Wren spent her first night in a cedar grove about a quarter mile from the boathouse, wrapped in her coat, listening to the cove. She was not frightened. She was angry, which is a more useful emotion. In the morning, she lit a small fire, made coffee in the tin she kept in her pack, and sat for an hour thinking carefully. She had a trade. She had tools. Not many, just the drawknife and a small folding square she kept in her shirt pocket. She had $11 and the ability to see what a piece of wood needed before it knew itself. What she didn't have was time to feel sorry for herself. She walked down to the boathouse as the fog was still lifting off the cove. The doors were padlocked, but the padlock was a relic, swollen with rust, and a firm pull with a pry bar she fashioned from a length of driftwood worked it loose in 20 minutes. Inside, the light came through gaps in the cedar boards in long, dusty lines, illuminating what looked at first like chaos. Old rope, a capsized dory, stacks of crates and barrels covered in mildew, a collapsed sawhorse, the rusted hull of a wood stove that someone had dragged in years ago and abandoned. It smelled of salt water and old wood and the particular stillness of a space that has been closed off from the world for a very long time. To anyone else in Dunmore's Landing, it was a ruin. Wren walked the perimeter slowly, her hands trailing along the walls. The structure itself was sound. The sills were dry. The roof, though moss-covered, hadn't given way, and the granite shelf beneath the floor planks had kept everything above the frost line. She examined the dory. Its hull was split along one strake, but the frame was intact. She looked at the stove. Cast iron, not as corroded as it appeared. She looked at the crates and noted that they were dovetailed pine, good joinery, not nailed together. She looked at the rope and saw hemp, not rotten, just stiff. Her mind ran through it all the way Harriet had taught her to look at a pile of lumber, not seeing what it was, but what it could become. She went back to the cedar grove, made a list on the inside cover of her field notebook, and thought it through until midday. Then she walked back into town. At the Landing's small office of the District Municipal Registry, she found that the Ballantyne Boathouse sat on Crown land. The granite shelf was not part of any private lot. She filed an informal occupancy notice, the kind that cost $3, and gave the occupant right of use for a 60-day period, renewable pending formal application. The clerk, a young man with spectacles who seemed mostly interested in his own paperwork, stamped it without looking up. She spent $5 more on a second-hand crosscut saw, a handful of cut nails, and a pot of linseed oil. That left her $3. She was all in. She knew it, and she walked back to the cove anyway. The work began the following morning. People on the road above the cove, those who knew the path along the headland used it, occasionally stopped to look down at the figure working below. A woman alone, pulling apart crates and stacking the lumber in neat rows, scrubbing rust from the old stove with a piece of rough stone. Someone shouted down once, "What are you doing down there?" She didn't look up. Someone else, "That building's not worth your time, girl." She kept working. It took 4 days to get the boathouse into a state she felt safe occupying. She rehung the doors using hardware salvaged from the dory's fittings and 2 new hinges she'd traded for a minor repair on a neighbor's fence rail. She patched the worst of the gaps in the siding using cedar strips she split from a log she'd found on the shore. She got the wood stove connected to the existing flue, which was sound, just blocked with a decade's worth of nesting material, and had a fire going by the end of the second day. She repaired the sawhorse, set up a rough shaving bench using a plank and 2 sawhorses she fashioned from driftwood, and began to work. Her first commissions came without her asking. The woman who ran the boarding house on Market Street had seen Wren pass with her tools and had stopped her to ask, half-jokingly, if she could fix a rocking chair that had been missing one arm for 3 years. Wren looked at the brake, found the original tenon was sound, cut a new arm from a piece of white ash she'd salvaged from the boathouse crates, fitted and glued it, and returned the chair 2 days later. The woman paid her $4 without hesitation and asked if she could do a set of 6 ladderbacks that needed recaning. Wren said she could. The dory she turned her attention to on her 5th day in the cove. It was a simple lapstrake hull, 16 feet, and the split strake was the only major failure. She steamed a new plank from one of the longer boards in her salvage pile. Cedar, fortunately, which was what the rest of the hull was, bent it into place over a series of forms she improvised from stacked stone, and fastened it with copper rivets she'd stripped from the boat's original fittings. The caulking she mixed herself, as Harriet had once shown her as a curiosity, from pine pitch and cotton wicking. When she set the dory in the cove on the 8th day, and it stayed afloat through an hour of careful rowing, she felt a quiet, specific satisfaction that had no name. She had been stripping and cleaning the interior of the boathouse by lantern light in the evenings, working methodically from the back wall forward. It was on the 11th night that she found it. There was a storage bench built into the back wall, a long, low structure, maybe 8 feet wide and 2 feet deep, with a hinged lid. It was the kind of thing you'd keep life preservers in, or coiled rope, or oiled canvas. Wren had assumed it was empty. She'd banged her knee against it twice in the dark and thought nothing of it. But on the 11th night, when she finally pried the lid up, she found the bench held a false bottom. She almost missed it. The interior looked empty, just bare wood, a few old boat hooks resting on the bottom. But Harriet had spent 6 years training her eye for joinery, and something was wrong. The depth of the bench from the outside was nearly 20 inches, but the interior depth was only 12. She stood for a moment with her lantern, looking at the floor of the bench, and then she pressed the heel of her hand along the seam at the back edge. There was a gap, not visible, but tactile, a thin discontinuity in the wood. She took her drawknife from her belt, slipped the tip of the blade into the seam, and lifted. A section of the floor swung up on a hidden piano hinge, tight and smooth, the hardware untouched by rust in the sealed interior. Beneath, it was a compartment about 6 inches deep, lined with oilcloth, and it was not empty. There were 2 things inside. The first was a leather satchel, mildewed on the outside but sealed with a brass clasp that had kept its interior dry. The second was a tin cash box, the old kind with a hasp lock. Its exterior surface bubbled with surface rust, but its seams still sound. Wren sat back on her heels and looked at both objects for a long moment. Her heartbeat was very loud in the silence of the boathouse. Then she reached in and lifted them out, one at a time, and set them on the shaving bench under her lantern. The cash box first. The hasp lock was simple. She worked it with the tip of a nail and the side of her drawknife blade, the same basic technique she'd learned from Harriet for freeing stuck drawer locks, and it opened on the second attempt. Inside, stacked in neat paper-wrapped bundles tied with string, was money. Banknotes, not coin. Dominion of Canada legal tender, by the printing on the wrappers. Each bundle was labeled in pencil in a careful small hand. She didn't count it that night. She could see that it was a great deal. The leather satchel held papers. She spread them on the bench. There were 3 documents: a letter of instruction, a detailed hand-drawn plan or survey of some kind, and a folded contract on formal letterhead, its edges browned with age. The letter was dated 11 years ago. It was addressed to no one by name. It began simply, "To whoever finds this," and it was signed by a man named August Ballantyne. She read it twice, slowly, by lantern light, while the cove made its quiet sounds outside. August Ballantyne, she came to understand, had been the eldest son of the family that had owned the fishery. He had run the operation in its final years, while his younger brother, Edwin Ballantyne, who sat on the town council and currently served as Dunmore's Landing's deputy reeve, had handled the business accounts. When the fishery collapsed, it collapsed fast. The kind of fast that in hindsight always has a reason. August had found the reason. He had found it in the accounts, specifically in a series of transfers Edwin had made over the course of 3 years, moving the fishery's operating capital into a separate holding company that Edwin owned under a different name. The fishery hadn't failed because the fish were gone. It had failed because Edwin Ballantyne had quietly emptied it, written off the losses as bad seasons and poor catches, and let the workers and creditors absorb the consequences while he kept the money somewhere safe. The cash in the box was what August had been able to recover before Edwin realized what he'd found. August had taken the operating payroll, 11 months of it, held in the fishery's own account, before Edwin could move it with the rest. He had hidden it here, with the documentation of what Edwin had done, intending to go to the provincial authorities. Then something had happened. The letter didn't say what. It only said that if August could not return for this, then whoever found it should take it to the RCMP detachment in Perth, because the papers would explain everything. August Ballantyne had been reported drowned the winter after the fishery closed. His body had never been found. Everyone said it was a tragedy. Wren sat in the boathouse for a very long time, the papers in her lap and the lantern guttering low. She understood 2 things simultaneously. The first was that Edwin Ballantyne had destroyed a fishery, cost dozens of families their livelihoods, and in all likelihood had arranged for his brother to disappear. The second was that Edwin Ballantyne was a powerful man in Dunmore's Landing, a man whose name was on a building and whose word carried considerable weight with the local magistrate. She was 22, had $11 to her name 11 days ago, and lived in a boathouse on Crown land. This was going to require care. She rewrapped the papers in their oilcloth, replaced the false bottom, and closed the bench lid. She left the cash box where it was, under the false bottom. She took only the letter, folded inside her field notebook, tucked into her shirt. She banked the stove, blew out the lantern, and lay on her cot in the dark, thinking. By morning she had a plan. She spent 3 days making preparations. She finished the rocking chair repair, and 2 of the boarding house ladder backs, and collected her payment, enough to eat and keep oil in the lamp. She made careful copies of all 3 documents in her own hand, writing in the small, precise script that Harriet had insisted on when recording measurements. She hid the originals back in the bench compartment. The copies she wrapped in canvas and gave to a woman she trusted, the same boarding house owner who had first hired her, a practical, unsentimental woman named August Fowler, who had known everyone in Dunmore's Landing for 40 years and owed no particular loyalty to Edwin Ballantyne or anyone in his circle. If I don't come back in 3 days, Wren said, take these to the RCMP in Perth. August Fowler looked at her steadily. Are you in trouble? Not yet, Wren said. I'm trying to make sure it stays that way. Then she went to find Corporal Bernard Tait. He was not hard to find. Dunmore's Landing had a 2-man RCMP detachment, and Tait was the senior officer, a solid, unhurried man of about 50, who had the look of someone who had stopped being surprised by people a long time ago. He was sitting on the front step of the detachment eating a piece of pie when Wren walked up. She said, Corporal Tait, I have something you need to see. He looked up at her, a young woman he vaguely recognized, dust on her boots, a drawknife at her belt, and his expression was the same patient, assessing look he gave everything. All right, he said, and set down the pie. She took him to the boathouse. She showed him the bench, the hidden compartment, the cash box, and the papers. She showed him the copies she'd made. She walked him through August Ballantyne's letter methodically, pointing to the relevant passages without editorializing. Tait read everything twice, asking no questions the first time through. He was particularly still when he read the contract between Edwin's holding company and a buyer in Kingston. A document that had been drawn up 6 months before the fishery failed, which meant the sale had been arranged before Edwin had finished clearing the accounts. When he finished, he looked at Wren. You've been sitting on this for 3 days, he said. It was not quite a question. I wanted copies made first, she said, and I wanted someone outside the landing to hold them. Tait looked around the boathouse, the repaired dory, the shaving bench, the wood stove with a kettle on it, the neat stacks of reclaimed lumber. He looked at the drawknife at her belt. He was quiet for a moment. You've built yourself a proper shop here, he said. I've tried, she said. Good work, he said. Then, I'll need these as evidence, all of it. I know, she said. They're yours. Tait moved carefully, the way good investigators move in small towns where everyone knows everyone, and the wrong word in the wrong place collapses a case before it begins. He made no calls from the landing detachment. He drove to Perth himself, spoke with the divisional inspector, and returned 3 days later with 2 additional officers and a warrant. Edwin Ballantyne was taken into custody on a Tuesday morning, quietly, at his office, without spectacle. He said nothing. His face, people who saw it reported, looked not so much shocked as tired, the way a man looks when he has been waiting a long time for a thing he knew was coming. The news moved through Dunmore's landing, the way water moves through old wood, slowly at first, then everywhere at once, filling every crack and recess. People remembered things. Old accounts that hadn't added up. Workers from the fishery who had never quite believed the story of the bad seasons. A few of the older men in town had quiet, direct conversations with Tait over the following week. Conversations that filled in the shape of what Edwin had done, and, more importantly, confirmed that August Ballantyne had not drowned by accident. There was a particular afternoon, about 2 weeks after Edwin's arrest, when Corporal Tait walked down the path to the boathouse and sat on the edge of the dock while Wren worked on a chair leg at her shaving bench. He had a folder of papers with him. He set it on the dock beside him. The Provincial Estate Review, he explained, had examined the cash box's contents. The payroll funds were identifiable. The records were all there, in August Ballantyne's careful hand. The workers who had been owed wages from the fishery's final season had been located, most of them, and would be compensated. There was a remainder after that, money that had been the fishery's own operating reserve, with no clear claimant now that the business was dissolved and August was gone. The review board had exercised its discretion. The formal letter inside the folder awarded Wren Balfour $640 as finder's compensation under the provincial unclaimed property statute, along with formal right of occupancy over the boathouse structure and its associated shoreline for a period of 5 years with right of renewal. Wren read the letter once, folded it, and set it on the bench beside her. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the cove riffled in the afternoon wind, and a pair of loons called somewhere toward the far shore. $640, she said. That's right, said Tait. She picked up the drawknife and turned the chair leg on the shaving horse and took a long, clean pass that curled a ribbon of maple onto the floor. The fit of the cut was exactly right. She could feel it in her wrists. The weeks that followed moved with a different quality than anything that had come before. Wren had grown accustomed to the feeling of being temporary, of occupying spaces on borrowed time, of keeping her footprint small because the floor might give way. The legal right to the boathouse didn't change that feeling overnight, but it changed the quality of the work she did inside it. She began on the repairs that she'd been putting off because they required permanence to justify. She rebuilt the north wall from the outside in, replacing the failed cedar boards with new stock she bought from the mill, fitting each one with care, face-nailing them in the proper overlap and painting them with a red ochre primer that went on in long, smooth strokes. She poured a small concrete pad for the wood stove and set a new flue liner. She built a proper workbench along the east wall, 8 feet long, thick maple top, twin-leg vises, a planing stop mortised flush into the surface. People came to the shop in a steadier stream now. The word that had spread about her work, the rocking chair, the ladder backs, and particularly the dory, which its owner had taken out on the cove and could not stop talking about, brought in more commissions than she could easily manage alone. She began to keep a simple ledger, the kind Harriet had taught her to keep, recording materials and time and payment, and she found that the numbers, handled honestly, were holding together. She wrote a letter to Gerald Finch in Ottawa. She did not ask for anything. She informed him, in plain language, that she had established a chair-making operation in Dunmore's Landing, and that, if the Ottawa buyer for Harriet Beaumont's workshop ever fell through, she would be willing to discuss purchase of the shop's seasoned lumber stock, which was worth more than he likely realized. She heard nothing back for 6 weeks. Then a brief reply arrived, stating that the Kingston sale had not, in fact, been finalized, and that he would be willing to discuss terms for the lumber. She bought every stick of Harriet's seasoned stock, 3 years of carefully dried maple, ash, cherry, and oak, at a fair price, had it carted to the boathouse in 3 loads, and stacked it in the back half of the space with the same precision Harriet had used. Each species separated, each board stickered to let the air move through. She stood in front of that stack for several minutes after the last load was in, her hands at her sides, and she thought of Harriet Beaumont, the flat, unsparing eyes, the nod that meant more than praise, the drawknife handed over without ceremony, because ceremony would have made it smaller. She set the drawknife on the workbench. She looked at it for a moment, its blade still true, its handles worn to the exact shape of familiarity. Then she hung it on the rack above the bench, in the place of honor that Harriet would have recognized as deliberate, and she got back to work. By the time the first snow fell on Dunmore's landing, Wren Balfour had 4 commissions ahead of her: a full winter's worth of seasoned wood, a repaired dory that people were already asking to hire for spring, and a shop with a door that locked it from the inside. She had a ledger that balanced. She had a proper shaving horse, and a planing bench, and a rack of tools that were hers, earned and paid for. She had a place. She was no longer passing through. She was somewhere. On a cold Saturday morning in November, Agnes Fowler brought bread down to the boathouse, a round sourdough loaf, still warm, wrapped in a clean cloth. She set it on the corner of the workbench and looked around at the space, at the lumber stacked in the back, at the repaired chair drying in the corner, at the neat row of tools above the bench, and the drawknife at the center of them. Harriet would have approved, she said. Wren split the loaf and handed half across. They stood at the workbench and ate in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who don't need to fill the air between them. We hope this story found you well tonight. If it stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a good tale of patience and quiet work. And here is our question for you. What is something you held on to, a tool, a skill, a habit, that someone else gave you, that turned out to be worth more than you knew at the time? Let us know in the comments below. We read everyone.